Well, hi everybody. Welcome again to Live Faith, another episode where we're just having a conversation talking about our faith and how that works out in our lives. Hopefully, encouraging all of you a little bit. This is going a little bit different direction than our previous episodes. Uh, I'll explain why in a minute. First off, my guest is my good friend James Rock. James and I have known each other for almost 20 years. We're getting very old, James.
Not just you, not me.
James has 30 years of ministry experience running Christian camps. He is the camp director at Trout Lake Camps up in the north of Brainerd, Pine Lake,
Pine River, Minnesota.
Pine River, Cross Lake area. He and I have been running the state youth conference together for this would have been the 18th year, I think, for
Makes me
me.
sad when you say would have been.
Would have been had we not had to punt that one. So I'm going to count it anyway. Next year is going to be 19 for me.
Oh, there you go.
I think.
We had all the pre-meetings. The meetings are the hardest part.
That's right. I mean, the actual conference is simple.
Yeah.
James is an author. He's written over 100 articles on youth ministry and Christian camping. He's a very good speaker. He is a former president of CCPA, which is very impressive, but none of us know what that is.
Christian Camp and Conference Association. It's all the camps in the country. Most of the good Christian camps are members.
It's a big deal. James is a big deal. James, thanks for taking some time with me. James and I run stuff by each other all the time. He threw this by me here a couple months ago and read it and agree with him. It's an important book. It's called Faith for Exiles, 5 Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon. I put up sort of my review on my blog, driventochrist.com last week. So you can check some my thoughts out there, but I want James to sort of share some of these concepts with us. First off, it's a book by Barna. Who's Barna?
So I think that's a great place to start. So Barna is essentially a statistic-keeping group that watches Christian trends in the United States, I think some in the world. They go out and ask questionnaires kind of nationwide, not a regional company, but a huge company that's trying to figure out what's happening in churches. They're probably best known for, Kinnaman did another book called Unchristian and a few other books like that talked about why people were leaving the church, why young kids were walking away from the church, or when they got to their senior year in high school, got out of youth group, they just kind of disappeared into the mist. And this was actually the first book that Kinnaman was associated with that really talked about, okay, here are the Christians that are left in churches in America. Here's what they look like, and here's the things that's affecting them. So they ask all these really, really hard questions about, when did you become a Christian? Why did you become a Christian? Why do you go to church? What are your key beliefs? Did somebody help you in that belief? How old were you when this happened? What keeps you planted in those things? It's very church-centric. And so for me, being in the camping industry, I'm looking at it more for who my staff are and who campers are that come to camp. For a pastor or a church, you can look at it and you go, okay, this is why when I look out from the pulpit into the audience, this is why these age groups are here. These are the connections to those groups. And so it's a great, they're just a great source for trends in trying to understand what's coming. Now, the hardest part is, this book that we're talking about, Faith for Exiles, for me, I want this to be about, 12 to 18-year-olds. What it really is about is millennials, which are those young 20-somethings, which are kind of my staff at this point at Trout Lake Camps, and not campers, but we can learn about the kids as we look through what's going on here. I think the other thing, too, that we need to be honest about, who knows how this is going to be affected with the virus issues that are going on. Who knows, statistically what's going to happen coming out of this weeks or months or whoever knows how long of church being on the other side of a screen, because a lot of this book talks about screens, and that's kind of the whole point in the exile piece.
Yeah, this I was thinking about that today. This virus issue is sort of a generation defining event, I think. Sort of like
Yeah,
9/11 defined the Gen Xers and the early millennials.
yeah, I think of my coming through. I was worried about Y2K and we were all going to die. And then, 9/11 actually something happens. And then with this virus, something actually happens. It'll be interesting to figure out, years from now, what effect does this virus have on people going to church? Is this drawing people to Jesus? Is this pushing people away from Jesus? I know like my Facebook feed is full of every pastor I've ever met doing something online. Well, speaking of people, pastors doing something online, and
Here we
so,
are.
how is that going to work? Here at camp, we are daily putting up a 20-minute kids TV show, trying to get Bible content to campers sitting in their living room at home. Is that what effect is that going to have on the world? It'll be interesting to see Barna's book about that soon to come.
Yeah, and just to highlight, that's why I think books like this are important, because we're talking specifically about the millennial generation, which Barna defines as 84, born from 1984 to born to 1998. So we're talking, what,
Mhm.
22 to 36 years old, which it's interesting to me because, everybody defines generations a little bit differently. I'm right on the line where in some cases I'm considered Gen X, in some cases they bump that down to somewhere around 1980, which would put me in the millennial category. So I sort of walk this line where I can see both sides of it. But as a church, by and large, we have to understand that every sort of age group, every generation is defined by their experiences. And that means they look at the world a little bit differently. So what we're talking about here is, how are the millennials looking at the world and in connection looking at the church?
And I think that goes a step further too. And Barnes mentioned it, and other a USA Today article about a year and a half ago mentioned it as well. One of the things is, I think we're way too long in our generations right now. There's a lot of discussion that you could be a brother of a younger brother of an older brother. You could be 5-6 years apart in your home and grow up in an absolutely different world right now. But statistically, that's really hard to figure out. It's really hard to parse out, because a lot of people talk, well, I'm way early in the millennials. I'm way late in the millennials. I'm in the middle of the millennials. And it feels like different people. I know with staffing, so we have high school kids, about 400 a summer, that come through our system. And we meet them as campers. They become junior high staff, then they become senior high volunteers, then they become summer staff. We can feel, and they feel different about every 3 or 4 years, where you can just see their hearts are different or their minds are different. And so it's always interesting to look at this data in this big group, but know that what's in front of you can be a little bit different, whether it's regionally. I call Minnesota the very northern part of the Bible Belt, or it's more of a just in our church or our style church, things are a little bit different. But I think it's still great information to know about the millennials.
So let's get into this a little bit. First off, we talk about this concept of being exiles, and
Mhm.
Kinnaman and Matlock, they dig into this idea of digital Babylon. Can you kind of explain where they're going with that?
Yep, and this is one of the things. So my staff and I, we've read through the book, the program staff, a lot of the millennials and younger staff that we have on the grounds, and this is one of the areas that they've really jumped on. You think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They've been captured and taken to this other world, and this king is telling them, do things this way, and they're in this other set of rules that's not what was before. They're exiled. They're moved away. And it was a exile that was done to them. If you look at what they're saying in Faith for Exiles, is this exile is more self-imposed, and it's self-imposed by this thing, because what's happened is, I don't ask my grandpa how to change the oil in my car anymore. I just go onto Google and I go to a YouTube video, and that shows me not only how to change oil in the car, but how to change oil in my specific car, which my grandpa probably doesn't know how to do. And so the source of information, the source of understanding, the source of news, the source of even trying to get my attention has completely changed. And the generation above us are no longer where we go to get that information. I know when I was growing up, and again, I graduated high school in 1988, but when I was growing up, my grandparents were these rocks in my life of biblical knowledge, of biblical understanding. And they sent me and my sisters to camp, and they said, we'll send you to Bible camp no matter what. And that's where my understanding of who God was and who Jesus was came from. Well, what's happening now is the millennial generation now, they like grandma and grandpa, but they're not necessarily trying to get information from them because it's all accessible on their own. So in this in this book, what they're talking about is where are kids getting their information? Where are kids getting their data from? And what's happening is they're going online and they're Google searching. And again, we can talk about faith specifically. So if I write faith in Jesus Christ in a Google search, there's going to be just as many pro Jesus things as incredibly negative Jesus things. I've got a youth pastor friend who was telling me the other day that he was talking to one of his kids in his youth group's friends, and he came to the youth group night, had a nice time, came to the youth group night the next week, and he started talking like a parrot about all these way too heady topics that were beyond his ability. And he's like asking this kid these questions, and the kid in front of him was nothing like the words he was using. And what the kid had done is he went to 5 websites that said how to refute who Jesus is, and then he just parroted all that to the youth pastor. And that's something that maybe wouldn't have happened before. I don't know if you've had it happen to you, Bart, but I've had pastor friends that tell me that people in the congregation will come up with their cell phones and correct them on their interpretation of 2 Timothy 4:9, because while they were talking about it from the pulpit, the people in the audience are on their screens looking at somebody else's opinion. And so that's something that's totally new, and it's interesting to see how that's having an effect on that millennial generation, that the information is so vast and so huge that how do you know what to grab onto, and also that total disconnect from the people that were older than you. You don't go to them to learn stuff. You actually teach them stuff. Actually, Grandpa, to change the oil on your car, this is how you do it. The way you do it is wrong. This is the first time in history that's been the case.
Yeah. And I have had that happen to me, and my mom wanted to buy me a mug that says your Google search doesn't overrule my master's degree. But
I like that.
yeah. So specifically in the book here, we're talking about what is keeping millennials in the church. I know I have sort of my roundup of it all, but what are you getting out of it?
Well, I think we can take a step back and go to essentially what Barna says is there's 4 kinds of exiles. And I think I showed you that chart that shows that if you want to put it up on screen. And basically, you have 4 different types of people. It pops up here. Yeah, go to that one right there. Yep. You have about 22% of this generation are ex-Christians. They're prodigals. And so they have left the church. And again, that's kind of named after the prodigal son who tells his dad, give me all my money and I'm going to go across the Sea of Galilee, and I'm going to go live in this other town where, all the bad things are happening. And that's what I want. Okay. And so these guys were Christians at some point, and for whatever reason, maybe it's a website, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's just a loss of faith, maybe it is a prodigal situation. They've walked away from the church. Okay. You have this 30% in that group of these nomads, or these just lapsed Christians that they were never quite in, they were never quite out. They just they're just kind of an almost a nothingness, kind of a lost group. You've got these habitual churchgoers who, man, they love the music. Again, 38%. They love the music. They love the community. They love what's going on there, but it's not necessarily having an impact on their life. They're not necessarily applying what they're learning at church to their day-to-day life. They're more or less present, but they're not quite there. And then you have this 10% that is in theory these resilient disciples, these active Christians, these trying to grow, trying to learn, trying to get to the next level, reading their Bible actively, grabbing an app like YouVersion, and every day reading the Bible and talking to their friends about what they read, or having Bible studies in their homes on Wednesday nights, and or they're doing something actively, and they're leading people around them actively. And so basically these are all people that have been touched by a once belief in Jesus, and then just kind of break into these separate groups. And I think one of the interesting things that maybe I push back a little bit is this kind of a concept of, well, there's less Christians than there were before, but that's okay, because what we've done is we've gotten rid of more of the people that were kind of they were lukewarm, let's say. There's less lukewarm, but there's more hots. There's more devoteds. And Barna would say that to some extent. In my ministry, in my connection, I don't think there's just all of a sudden this huge group of much more devoted Christians. I think it's about the same as it always was, but we've kind of lost those fringes. So I think we got to be careful that we don't overstate, well, there's less Christians in the United States than ever before, but they're better now. Well, I think it's about the same average we had before. The interesting part is going to be in watching the millennial generation. Are they going to have that comeback? The generations before have rebelled against their parents. And you can't tell me what to do. I'm going to go be my own man or woman or whatever. They go out in the world, and then they have kids, and then they slowly, they come back to a Christmas service. Then they're like, oh, that felt kind of like home to me. And they kind of retool and come back to the church. One of the interesting things about the millennials is they didn't shake their fists at their parents. The millennials were so, I got to be careful here, so connected to their parents, and their parents were so connected to their day-to-day life, and so helpful, and so not oppressive. I'm trying to say all the right words, that there wasn't really this massive rebellion that happened in previous generations. And so it's interesting that there's really not a reason to come back around to what mom and dad thought, because they never really disagreed with it. They just woke up and said, that's not for me, or that is for me, and I'm going to make that a big part of my life. Or even, I'm just going to show up at church, and it won't affect my day-to-day, but I do like going to church, and I do like waving to grandma and mom and dad, when I go. So it'll be interesting to see the longevity of these guys. But let's go back to the resilience. The resilience, I think, for me, I right away running a camp, I go, I want to hire all resilience, and I want to hire all these kids that are devoted in their day-to-day walk with Jesus. What does that look like? I think what the church can do right now is start to look at those trends and look at the things that the resilience are grabbing onto that's maybe different than the generation before. Like one of the things with the resilience is they found those kids got saved, met Jesus, put Jesus in their heart, whatever the phrasing that you want to say. They met him a little older. Instead of being in the 6 or 7 or 8 range average, they were meeting Jesus at 10, 11, 12, which is kind of interesting. That's a pretty big statistical change there between a resilient in let's say a prodigal or a habitual or a nomad. It seems like the kids that are keeping it in their faith and keeping in their day-to-day walk, they actually grabbed onto their faith a little later. And again, for church, for the way that we do kids classes, or for camp, the way that we do things, it might be interesting there to figure out, well, why is that? Why are some of those trends there that makes them different? And then also the resilience do have a connection to the older people in the church. If you put that big chart up, Bart, and you look down at the bottom of it, in the meaningful relationships part, go down, yep, that one. So if you look down in the meaningful relationships part, again, we're talking about resilient resilient millennials. You know, the church is a place where I feel I belong, 88%. There's someone in my life who encourages me to grow spiritually, 85%. The other side, when growing up, I had a close personal friends who were adults from my church, 77%. So I think one of the things that maybe we need to look at in the way that we're delivering to the church who Jesus is we need to make sure that there's somebody alongside these millennials, these 20-somethings, that's going around and giving them a side hug and pulling them along and saying, hey, how can I help? How can I be available to you? How can we work together? And the other part that's really, really interesting, that again, camp took away, there's statistics that Barna found that the church has a really bad attitude. And the bad attitude is, we're just glad you're here. We're just glad that you came, and we don't want to do anything that would make you not be here. Bart, you and I have talked about this 1,000 times. It's the de-Bibleization of church. It's the self-helpianity of church, where we just read a Bible verse and then we tell a bunch of cool stories, and we don't get caught up in the Bible part, because that'll push the millennials away. If you look at what Barna's figuring out here, it's very interesting that what's happening is, if these guys aren't pushed, they'll walk away. And we've had the wrong read for a while. So I look at some of the churches out there, you know, the pastors are all online, you know, doing all their stuff online, and you go, wow, you did 30 minutes on a half a Bible verse. And what I'm reading about the millennials right now is that's not what they wanted. They don't want us just to be happy that they're there. They want us actually to push them. Yeah. And again, that's not universal, and some people aren't going to like it. But the exiles want to be pushed in their faith. They want to be held accountable to something. And if you don't, what you'll end up is losing those resilience. You'll lose the resilience, and you'll end up with those middle categories that are disinterested anyway. And so that's a really interesting part of this book to me.
Yeah, and you know, I think we've seen that up at camp too, where, you know, I go up to Trout Lake every year and I teach staff training, and I tell people I take a full year of Bible college systematic theology and I teach it in about 3 hours. You know, we know we set that up to be aggressive. You and I and Tate, everybody's going to meet Tate soon, work together, say we're going to push this really hard, really fast, but then we're going to sort of let it flesh itself out. It's a quick dump and then see where it goes. One of the things that I hear almost every year from somebody in that group is, wow, I wish my church would have taught that. You know, and we're just talking, we're talking the basic foundations, the statement of faith. You know, nothing overwhelmingly deep, but there's some significance in it. And they keep saying, I wish my church went there, but they never did. We never got past, you know, Noah built the ark.
Yeah. And again, this isn't fair either, but we take our interns. So our intern program is called the Apostleship Program, and it's somewhere between 8 and 12 kids a year. They're in a gap year program. They're not quite in college. They're either not in college yet, or took some time off, or just got out of college. We take them over to Israel, and it is amazing when they're standing in Israel, looking over the Sea of Galilee, and you stand next to them, you point out, and you go, okay, you see that right there, that's the New Testament. That's the Gospels. It happened right there. And their eyes just get open, and they get so excited about it. And I think where the church is in trouble right now is that we need to have an uncomfortable amount of scripture, an uncomfortable amount of relying on God's word, an uncomfortable amount of saying, nope, this is the thing. And I think it's okay if some people roll their eyes, because the resilience, the ones that are left over, the ones that are pushing their faith, that's what they're looking for. That's what they're going to be drawn to. And again, Barna can can put that up statistically and say, statistically, this is where we're going. Now, that's not to say, back in the day, we used to call it spiritual formation. And so if I get up and speak somewhere, I'd say, okay, what am I aiming at? Am I aiming at people that believe, people who don't believe, people who've been in the church forever, people who have never been to church? And I'd figure out my audience, and I'd take the biggest amount of time towards that key graphic that they wanted me to go to, but I'd make sure I hit the other ones at some point in the sermon. Well, right now, I think as a church, we want to make sure that we're reaching out to the prodigals, the nomads, the habitual churchgoers. Actually, the prodigals probably aren't there. But we want to make sure we're reaching out to those habitual churchgoers. But we want to make a home for the resilient kids. We want to ask them, what do they want? What do they want musically? What do they want prayer-wise? What do they want Bible study-wise? Again, I've got hundreds of staff that live in the cities and in Iowa and all over the place that I'll go visit them and I'll say, okay, where are you going to church? And they're saying, I'm not going to church, but I have a beers and Bible study every Wednesday night, and there's 20 people coming, and you're just like, again, I'm an old guy. I'm like, what did you just say? But they're actually would rather meet on Wednesday, Thursday night with a group of friends and just hammer verse by verse by verse than to go into church and, love the music, love the this, that, and the other thing, but the teaching's not pushing them. And the problem is then you end up with this weird, bad theology because you're not getting theology from somebody who has a master's degree. And so we've got to figure out a way, as the church as a whole, as the Christian body as a whole, how can we preach solid biblical teaching that draws the ears of these resilients, and gets them excited? And that's it's a hard task ahead of us.
It really, at least for me, it ends up boiling down to, on some level, relationships. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And again, I hit that meaningful relationship piece. The church is someplace where I feel like I belong. I think that is huge. That's 88% of resilience are saying, I feel like I belong in my church. What are we doing as a church to make sure that people feel like they belong? And it's different because if you, I know myself, shaking the person's hand at the front of the church when I walk in is the worst thing you could possibly do to me. Didn't grow up at church. I grew up at camp. I was told all these terrible things about church as a kid, and having to shake that guy's hand at the front door is horrible for me. I've talked to staff that talk about that's one of the reasons why they don't go. They just want to sneak in the back and get the Bible content and sneak out. They don't want some of those overbearing and being careful. I'm not a church guy. That super friendly, a smile on the face of the guy that's always got that smile on his face. They want something that's more tangible than that. They want a relationship that's more real.
Right. I think that's what that is. It's not that they are against the greeter at the door. It's that that's clearly staged. That person was told to be there by the pastor, by the board. They're not really that happy that you're there.
And they can only get the one guy to do it anyway. And that goes back to this. So one of the things that we've got to remember on these millennials, they have a filter in their brain that's different than any other filter that's ever happened. They've been advertised to more than anybody in the world. I always use a story. When I was a kid, again in the 80s, I believed that if I bought Michael Jordan's basketball shoes, it would help my game. Obviously, if I drink Gatorade, that'll help my sports. At the time, things have changed, but back then I was a jock, and I just thought, well, if I buy the right equipment, that will help my game. Well, these guys know it won't. These guys know they're being advertised to. These guys are looking for real. Now, it also has to have funny. It also has to have some other pieces. It also has to be deep. It also has to have more emotion than maybe I like some days. But if you're just going to put this facade on and walk around with this facade, they see through it. And they see through it instantly. They're not asking for perfection, oddly. but they're asking for real. And that's where you look at these resilience and you go, how can we meet them where they feel the most comfortable? Because you're never going to create a perfect church for everybody. But what's the pieces that you can put in your church, or in your walk, or in the way you just walk around town, that is attractive to those kids that are like, I'm trying to grow in my faith. Will somebody please help me figure this out?
Yeah. Well, I think we're kind of coming to an end of our time here. So let's end with this, James. What is one thing that you think our average churchgoer can do most effectively in order to bring the gospel to especially that younger generation?
I think it's, I'll use my parents-in-law. They are super Christians. When I first met them and met my future wife, they one church wasn't good enough for them. They went to 2 churches over the course of a Sunday. They were just these devoted Christians, and they just make me laugh to this day because they're so mindful about it. But the thing that they do better than anybody that I've ever met is they open their house, and they open their lives to people. And they're not just these Christians standing in the foyer of the church, but the way that they act, the way that they speak, the way that they are welcoming to people, and they bring people to them in whether it's international staff, which they had a huge ministry to, whether it's bringing neighborhood kids around and just being a place that neighborhood kids could go and be safe. They just had a way of finding ways to inviting people to their homes. And again, I can use camp as this for a little bit. With our staff, over the course of the summer, we bring staff to our house multiple times a summer just for food and to relax. And there's no study, there's no anything. We just invite people just to be around us. And through that lack of socialization and that need of face-to-face and that need of relationship, not with a Bible study, not with the details of that, but you start that relationship and then you reflect who Jesus is to others, then you'll get from them the question, hey, what are you doing? How are you doing this? Where do you get that idea? What's that coming from? And it needs to be more natural. It can't be Michael Jordan hawking tennis shoes. It's got to be Jesus is real in my life, and this is how I know. And that's not my opening conversation with a 25-year-old that just got married, or a 27-year-old that just popped out a kid. That's not my opening thing. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. But the opening thing is how can I help? How can I be a part of your life? Okay, you're asking this. I get that from 2 Timothy. I get that from 1 John, and then you piece that together. And it's maybe authenticness is the important part. How can you be an authentic follower of Jesus in the world that you live in, and not this bad ad on the side of the highway of what a Christian should look like. And that is what I think is going to draw more resilient Christians and have a better effect.
Completely agree. Thank you, James. Appreciate this. For those of you who are watching, thank you for joining us. If you want to know more about Trout Lake Camps, I'm going to post a link in the description, but also coming up real soon here in one of the very soon future episodes, we're going to be interviewing James's co-worker, his former intern, my former intern, Tate Hoagland, to talk a little bit more specifically about what Trout Lake Camps looks like and what it's like to work for James Rock.
Oh, man.
That'll be a good one. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on LiveFaith.
Thanks, everybody.